So today we're joined by Nick Franz of Altitude Intelligence. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm good, Jake. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And thank you for joining us. So could you give us a little bit of information about your expertise, but also Altitude Intelligence's mission statement?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in military and government intelligence, where in altitude we take tradecraft and methods from defense and national security and apply that to the commercial space, where decisions are just as important and consequential as what's happening in government. So in conflict environments, geospatial intelligence isn't just a nice to have, it kind of drives decision making. It's one of the core principles of intelligence, and that's what Altitude Intelligence is bringing to the commercial space. We call ourselves an intelligence as a service company, where our model is we take proven government intelligence systems that are now commercially available, especially in the geospatial space. They're stress tested in very difficult environments, and we make them accessible without the overhead of building up these teams and these capabilities in-house. So our mission statement, very, very straightforward. It's intelligence that makes a difference when every decision counts. And that's why we're excited about the Cytora partnership as a good example of that in practice.
Great, thank you. And yeah, you touched on a lot of interesting things that I imagine throughout the rest of our discussion we'll dig into a little deeper. But I guess to kick it straight off, so if underwriting is ultimately about understanding exposure, how does viewing risk through a spatial lens fundamentally shift our philosophy from simply knowing where an asset is located to genuinely understanding how it interacts with its environment and behaves under stress?
Yeah, knowing a coordinate is not the same as understanding a place. In conflict analysis, that's learned the hard way. A grid reference or a lat long tells you nothing about elevation, choke points, lines of sight, or what flows through an area under pressure. And the same logic applies in underwriting. Spatial intelligence asks what surrounds an asset, what flows towards it, how the terrain and environment behave when conditions deteriorate. So that shift from risk as a static label to risk as a dynamic relationship. A property exists in a physical system, and exposure is really about understanding how the system behaves under stress. Military planners have understood this for centuries, and millennial insurers are just catching up.
Great, yeah, no, thank you. And that's one of the things that was intriguing me, I guess, what the crossover or the learnings that insurance can take from other industries, and military is an interesting industry, let's call it, to learn from, I guess, with very high stakes on data, and they really need to understand the context of data and how it plays out in reality rather than just on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, military intelligence is basically just calculating risk and providing commanders with different answers to what their risk questions are. So it's very similar overlap, just different data.
hmm Yeah, makes total sense. And when we look at risk from this, I guess, elevated and high resolution perspective, what hidden vulnerabilities or physical relationships emerge between an asset and its surroundings that insurers historically assume might be identical on paper?
Well, so two buildings can sit in the same postcode and can look identical on paper, but one can sit on a ridge with natural drainage away from it, and the other sits in a basin collecting surface water from three directions. So they have completely different exposure, invisible to a data feed. In conflict zone analysis, we'd call this terrain advantage. The physical environment determines the outcome regardless of what a map label would say. So the now available commercial high resolution spatial analysis also services correlated vulnerabilities, clusters of assets sharing the same failure node under the same event. So in conflict analysis, this is called a single point of failure, where infrastructure looks distributed until one event reveals it all depends on the same bridge, the same substation, the same road or access point. So portfolios can have the same problem in insurance.
Yeah, understood. And I guess to boil it down, then it's you could really simplify it to a precision of data piece. Like a postcode is perhaps not a precise enough measurement to really understand the difference between two locations within that postcode. So what you've just described, how does understanding this, the physical relationships between a building and its surrounding terrain, infrastructure, and environment, how does that change the way insurers do and perhaps should think about vulnerability?
Well, a building is a node in a physical system. Vulnerability is a property of the system, not just the structure. So this is foundational in military geospatial intelligence. You don't assess a target in isolation. You assess it within its environment. So let's take wildfire. You look at slope, prevailing winds, vegetation density, proximity to previous burn scars. Each has a physical relationship, and together they tell you something completely different from a single hazard score. In insurance, when underwriters think in terms of physical relationships, vulnerability stops being binary and it becomes something you can reason about. Under what conditions, from what direction, in which sequence of failure. That's how you treat threat assessment in conflict environments, and that's how physical risk assessment should work in insurance.
Got it. So I guess context in combination with precision would kind of cover that. And it makes sense the way you position that there, how transferable that is to insurance and the potential benefit they can gain. So I guess in the increasing kind of volatility that we see at the moment, how do insurers make that move from knowing where a property is located to genuinely understanding how it behaves under stress? And why does the distinction matter?
Well, using historical record, which most pricing models are built on, is unfortunately increasingly unreliable as a guide to future loss and risk. We see the same problem in conflict analysis, where patterns of activity break down when the operating environment shifts. So a great example from a few years ago in conflict space was when the Ukrainian military started using electronic warfare to block Russian drones, while the Russian military pivoted and started using fiber optic drones. So the environment can shift very quickly on the battlefield. Now, obviously, it doesn't happen in the same way with insurance, but a property can look fine under normal conditions and behave differently on a tail event. And that's exactly when that historical static data runs out. So it's a practical shift. Stop asking where it is and start asking what happens to it when this happens and why, and build the data infrastructure to answer that before the loss and not after. In intelligence, we call this predictive terrain analysis. In insurance, it's a difference between pricing adequately and finding out you were wrong at claims time.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you've touched on a third, I guess, cornerstone of data there is a propensity for data to change over time. Like we might look at data and that's maybe a month old, maybe even less, maybe a week old, and assume that it's accurate and up to date, but things change fast, especially across many variables. So a third kind of real important factor to consider. So there's an abundance of that data available, environmental, location. Can you give an example of a signal that maybe looks meaningful on the surface, but consistently could mislead underwriters? And how do you filter for that?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but wildfire hazard scores, most of these are modeled on historic wildfire perimeters, but post-fire land use changes, so dead vegetation, altered soil permeability, and upstream developments increase ignition risk that weren't previously reflected. A property with a low score today might sit in a fundamentally different environment than when the score was assigned years ago. So does this signal reflect current physical conditions or historical administrative decisions? Those are fundamentally two different things, and conflating them is where a lot of underwriting errors can originate. So the same principle applies when analysts are assessing conflict zones, where you verify currency before you weight a source, regardless of how official it is.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good example that highlights what we've discussed so far. So that the context is important, the precision is equally as important, and we must be aware that data can change over time. And those three things considered are probably instrumental to ensuring the data you've got is going to inform decisions in the way that you need it to. So, following that, I guess, how can asset level geospatial clarity improve not just individual risk decisions, but the overall resilience of a commercial portfolio?
So the individual risk improvement is real, but the portfolio level benefit is where the most significant value sits. With asset level physical clarity, you can map concentrations not just geographically, but by failure node. So where an asset share the same vulnerability under the same event, in conflict analysis, is called critical infrastructure mapping. I kind of touched on this earlier. So understanding not just where the individual nodes, but where the systematic dependencies that create cascading failures including second and third order effects. So carriers who understand this and understand their physical concentration can make deliberate decisions about where they want exposure, rather than discovering it after a major event has revealed it.
Mhm. Yeah, and it also sounds like that's kind of bringing in some of the economies of scale conversations as well, where we can look at individual risks, and to that risk, the data can make all the difference, but it's how do you apply that across your entire portfolio? That's where the real benefit is to be gained by commercial insurers, I guess.
Right, exactly.
Mhm. So, how does earlier visibility into physical context influence triage, specialist routing, and capital discipline? And what's lost when the context only arrives later in the process?
So when a submission arrives and you already know it sits in a physically complex environment, you route that to the right specialist immediately rather than discovering that 3 or 4 steps later. That mirrors how intelligence products are tiered in defense contexts. High complexity environments get evaluated analytically with the attention from the start, not after a generic assessment has already been missed in the nuance of intelligence development. So what's lost when the conflicts arrive, what's lost when the context arrive late is mispricing that only becomes really visible at a property loss. So capacity deployed on a risk specialist would have restructured, and the time spent on manual research that automated enriching should happen at ingestion.
And I guess that maps to when the context arrives late. So does a true understanding of the risk, at which point decisions may already have been made, vulnerabilities have it's past understanding where the vulnerability is, and at that point, there's no control over the risk and the loss for insurers. And on that, then, I guess in today's precarious adapt or fail technological landscape, the speed and accuracy of decision making are critical. Why does it matter that spatial intelligence is embedded at the point of ingestion rather than applied as a downstream research layer?
Well, manual spatial research introduces a couple of problems: speed and consistency. By the time it's done manually, the decision window may have closed, and some submissions get through research while others get a quick check with no visibility at the difference. So, in a time sensitive operational context, conflict or commercial, intelligence that arrives after the decision has already been made is just an audit trail, and it's not a decision support tool. So embedding this geospatial context at ingestion means every submission gets the same quality of physical context automatically before a human looks at it. So that consistency is valuable almost as much as the insight itself, and it's what makes the system defensible at the scale that this is brought in.
Yeah. Underwriters need the context to decision at the point of decisioning, I guess really. There's little use to super accurate, precise and contextual data come in maybe in the middle of the decisioning process or perhaps at the end of it. By then it's too late to really be of any benefit to portfolios and insurers. So on spatial insight then, does embedding the spatial insight earlier in the workflow augment underwriter expertise, or does it risk shortcutting the judgment that experienced underwriters bring?
The risk is real if the tool is designed poorly, and that distinction matters when it's augmentation versus automation. So, spatial intelligence should narrow uncertainty before the underwriter applies their judgment, not replace the judgment. Geospatial intelligence is one tool in an all-source intelligence for product in a defense environment. So the analyst is never removed from the loop, and the tools exist to make the analyst faster and better informed, not to root around them. And that same system applies with underwriting. So the best underwriters will use spatial data to model, not just accept it, asking whether the analysis matches what they know about the account, the sector, the geography. If the tool can't be interrogated, it's a black box, and that concern is legitimate.
Absolutely. Bringing us back to context, really, I guess there's always going to be space for that human element within the decisioning process because the human element brings the expertise and can really link together that context. The context isn't there to become a decision. It's there to support the decisioning. And so how do you ensure the spatial data that's underpinning these insights is reliable? I mean, you touched on black box. So how do we ensure that it's reliable, current, and auditable for underwriting purposes?
Reliability to us means clear sourcing on every source of data. So what was captured, at what resolution, under what conditions, what models were used to model flooding, what wildfire models were used to model wildfire spread. It's non-negotiable in intelligence work, and sourcing is always provided in every intelligence document because the source is the biases in which you weigh every claim. So intelligence without a source just isn't actionable, either in defense or in insurance space. And currency requires defined update cadences by data type as well, because a data set from 5 years ago may encode a physical reality that no longer exists, with audibility at every insight. So it's traceable back to a source, a timestamp, and explainable. And this is because underwriting decisions get challenged after losses, just as an intelligence assessment would get scrutinized after an operation.
Absolutely. And I love how you position that there. It's a non-negotiable, and that's how commercial insurance should view it, really. There's little value in data that can't be looked into, can't be kind of verified and validated in terms of its accuracy and its sources. So yeah, absolutely, I totally agree with you there. And on the spatial intelligence, then, where might it still fall short for in the context of, I guess, the kinds of risk or exposure that remain difficult to capture, even with rich geospatial data?
Yeah, so the clearest gap is essentially what happens inside the building. I mean, we're operating with commercially available geospatial data. Maybe the militaries have capabilities to look inside buildings, but insurance carriers don't. So what occupants, operators, maintenance, and human behavior, these drive loss outcomes that don't show up on a map. And obviously, this is the same in conflict analysis, where every physical feature you can map in an environment, but you can't fully map what people are doing inside that environment. So subsurface risk, global coverage gaps, those are other serious and honest limitations. So soil instability and legacy contamination are improving but still patchy in some parts of the world where this underlying data infrastructure simply just isn't there at commercial useful resolution yet. Some of the most conflict-affected regions are also the least mapped, and that's not a coincidence. Like, we're not going to get very good flood mapping data in Africa, but you'd get FEMA data from the United States. So you have to be honest of where your global data coverage map limitations are.
Yeah, and is the approach underwriters and insurers should take to that then one of accounting for it by being accurate, precise, where they can, to ensure that loss is minimized and risk is best understood in the face of those, I guess, lapses in available data?
Yeah, it's important to be honest with what data you do have and incorporate that geospatial data appropriately with that fundamental understanding from the beginning.
hmm Yeah, it makes total sense. It's a case of, I guess, there's data that just can't be gathered, perhaps now, or can't be gathered ever. And so you need to do your best to kind of work around that by improving what you can access. So, how much do you think spatially intelligent underwriting will reshape competitive advantage in commercial insurance? And what might that look like in practice for carriers who move early versus those who don't?
Well, in my opinion, early movers are building a compounding advantage. Better intelligence is better pricing and better risk selection and better loss experience with each cycle reinforcing the next. And that's building, in our opinion, a genuine data moat. So we're seeing the same dynamics in defense contracting, where agencies and combatant commands that invest early in geospatial intelligence capability build that institutional knowledge that will take years for others to replicate. And late movers, while they face adverse selection at scale, the risks that spatially sophisticated carriers will decline to mitigate toward those without the capability at prices that don't reflect reflect the real exposure. So loss ratios will diverge, and by the time it's really visible in the numbers, it's already structural.
Yeah, absolutely. And compounding, I think, is the best way to look at that. Like the gap will grow, and as it does, the rate of growth of the gap will also grow. So it really is a time to adopt new methodologies, shift cultures, to be able to accept new data sources and properly interrogate data sources to inform decisions. So we we operate in an era of absolute data abundance, but raw data without context, as we've discussed, is often just noise. As the industry shifts towards what you've coined as intelligence as a service, how should insurers fundamentally rethink their relationships with data providers to ensure that they're receiving actionable, synthesized intelligence rather than just another feed that could potentially mislead an underwriter?
Well, raw data feeds and raw geospatial data feeds are approaching a commodity status. So the question that insurers should be asking isn't, well, what data do you have? It's, what have you done with it? What's been filtered out and why? And what are your confidence level on these insights? The intelligence community has operated with this distinction for decades. Raw collection of data is not intelligence. Analysis, synthesis, and source weighting are what turn data into something that you can actually act on. So that implies a different relationship where the intelligence provider takes analytic responsibility for the output and not just delivers the file. If they can't explain in plain terms why a signal is meaningful for a specific risk, then that's a data vendor, not an intelligence partner.
Yeah, makes sense, and that conversation's one that we're hearing more and more of recently. A two-way relationship between data providers and consumers of data, is important as well in terms of validating the data that they receive in real time. Um, Spoken to a couple of property and kind of risk, climate risk professionals recently that have really stressed the importance of being able to validate their data for real uses. And on that data, so AI and machine learning, they really take on the heavy lifting in kind of processing complex geospatial environments. How do we ensure that delivering this intelligence as a service genuinely augments the underwriter's expertise rather than risking, as we've discussed, a black box scenario that shortcuts human judgment?
Well, I think you said it well earlier that it's a two-way street. I mean, this data is and services are provided, but we want to hear a response from the customers on what's working and what isn't. But in reality, AI is necessary at this scale. The volume of geospatial data required for asset level insights at submission speed is beyond what a human analyst can do. The design principle must be AI surfaces the signal, but a human evaluates the significance. And that's exactly what we believe. We use AI tools to augment our human analysts. And this is the model that the defense intelligence agencies have been working toward for years. So automated processing of satellite imagery and signals data with the human analyst making the consequential judgment about the importance of that. So that requires explainability built from the start, when a spatial analysis flags an elevated exposure, the underwriter needs to see what's driving it, at what confidence level, and from what data source. Otherwise, it's not a tool.
Yeah, and that's being surfaced more and more as AI really experiences its boom at the minute. Over the past 5 years, it's perhaps not been fully understood how it's going to play into the human aspect of various different industries, but using it as a tool to empower decisions really seems to be the best way to boil it down. And given the rapid advancements in how spatial data is captured and modeled, how should insurance leadership evaluate the reliability and currency and auditability of modern service models? Like, what specific transparency should they be demanding from intelligence partners today that they weren't perhaps asking for 5 years ago?
Well, 5 years ago, the question was, do you have coverage for a location? And that bar today is way too low. So leadership should be asking, well, what update cadence, what methodology independence do we want to use? Are we drawing from the same data sets as everyone else? Are we building the same blind spots as everywhere else, where everyone else is buying the data from? And full auditability on the past decisions. So these are the same questions that defense procurement has been asking of geospatial providers for years, and commercial insurance is overdue for the same kind of standard. It's non-negotiable today. Like I said, the source, the timestamp, the confidence level, and known limitations for every material signal that maybe wasn't asked 5 years ago, and it should be routine now.
Hmm. Yeah, again, I think there's an understanding of what's possible that is still working its way into commercial insurance that, as you've mentioned, in intelligence probably has been there for a good while. But I think understanding what's possible and then building that culture and attitude towards it in that it's not negotiable is going to really facilitate that change towards kind of more intelligent decisions being made in insurers. And ultimately, how much do you believe that the adoption of genuine service-driven spatial intelligence will reshape the competitive landscape? What does the harsh reality look like in the next few years for carriers who move early to embrace this technology versus those who cling to legacy property data processes?
Well, I don't think it's a technology upgrade. It's a competitive repositioning. So early movers are building something that compounds with every event season. Late movers accumulate these adverse selection quietly and then very loudly. So the parallel in defense world is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability, where militaries that invested in this capability didn't just gain a tactical advantage, they restructured what modern conflict looks like. And the window to build the strategic investment rather than a crisis response is measured in years and not decades. So the carriers who wait will be buying the capability at a much higher cost later on, both in technology and talent, but the loss that they experience accumulates in the meantime.
So it's a real inflection point. The risks of not adapting and moving forward become ever greater whilst the benefits do, and it just really separates and grows that gap between adopters and non-adopters.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it a lot and not as powerful, but very similar in the use of AI in these both commercially and in publicly available models. Is that it's an inflection point, and now is the time to decide how you want to roll those out in your business.
Yeah, yeah, and we feel that across all industries, I think. But there's a unique opportunity in insurance, really, given it's there's an aversion to risk within insurance, which makes total sense. But that means that perhaps they've moved a little slower than certain other industries. So the opportunity is there to really move forward, solidify competitive advantage, and grow their business in the way that their goals dictate. So I've got one more question for you. What would you change about the insurance industry and why?
Well, short answer, nothing. I love the insurance industry. But more seriously, I think that industry is organized around the data it inherited and not the data that it chooses. So it's using these legacy data sets on legacy models, and these models shape the way the industry thinks. But breaking that loop requires deliberate investment of new ways in seeing risk. The defense intelligence community went through this transition when satellite imagery and open source data became available at scale. 10, 15 years ago, we weren't seeing tweets of drones hitting buildings. We weren't seeing this information online. That information came through old-fashioned human intelligence sources, and now it's available publicly on the internet. So the organizations that adapted to this thrived, and the ones that didn't became irrelevant. So fundamentally, the insurance industry needs to internalize that that the map is not the territory. The gap between data abstraction and physical reality is where a surprise loss comes from. So closing that gap isn't just a technology initiative, it's a new underwriting principle.
Yeah, and I think that'll resonate with a lot of our listeners that experience that in real time. So yeah, no, Nick, thank you. It's been fascinating hearing about, I guess, where insurance can learn from intelligence. And the key message I think, to take from this really boiled down to a simple point is the context, the precision, and the currency of data are all super important and they need to be factored into all decisions.
Absolutely, Jake. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. All the best. Thanks, Nick.